So let's get back to work. I pointed out to you last week that arguably the most famous commentary about inflation ever made came from a Nobel Prize winner, Milton Friedman, who argued that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. But we demonstrated in later work that that's kind of a loose statement that has many interpretations. And those interpretations now have us saying the best thinking is that we have to look at the relationship between money and inflation in much softer terms. We don't know how much is too much money supply growth, although we know that too much money supply growth tends to be inflationary. We know that if you have that money supply growth for too long, but we don't know how long that is, you'll eventually get inflation. But eventually, what does that mean? When? Is that in a year? Is that in 2 years? Is that in 2.5 years? We don't really know. And if you do get higher rates of inflation, how much higher does it go? We don't know. So what do we conclude? That the relationship is long-term. It is highly uncertain. It has dimensions to it that are vague in terms of how much is too much money, how long is too long that you see excessive money supply growth, when does the inflation show up, how high does it get? All these things are highly uncertain. This is the best thinking as we sit here in 2021, and this is really as far as we can go. It doesn't mean that there's no economic theory that works. There is theory around this. There are still people, mainly within the monetary community or the Federal Reserve, who still believe that these relationships exist, but we all know that they're long-term relationships and they're highly uncertain. That is clear. That was the main point that we made in the previous classes. We ended last week by talking about hyperinflation, the fact that in some countries we've seen extraordinary inflation rates that have been in the 4 digits or 5 digits annualized. And at different points in time, it has affected countries in all kinds of continents. Africa, South America, Europe, North America, Asia. It's been really all over the place. A common thread to it has always been that there's been too much money supply growth. That's consistent with what I just mentioned to you. It's true, there's been too much money supply growth. But that relationship between money supply growth and inflation is always different in each case. What is clear that in each case, there are other elements that are involved in this, so that we conclude that money is never the cause of inflation. Excessive money supply growth for too long is never the cause. It can be one of the causes, but more likely you think of money supply growth as being the fuel that fuels the inflation, sort of like the fuel in an automobile. What makes a car go forward is the mechanics of the car, but it doesn't do anything if there's no gas in the gas tank. So we think of it as accommodating inflation and making it possible for it to happen, but it is never the cause. The cause is a number of things, of which money supply growth that's excessive can be one of those things, but it is never singularly the cause of inflation. And that's pretty much where we ended. So one of the things that we look at all the time as macroeconomists are different measures of inflation. We look at those measures of inflation by looking at what we refer to as price indexes. There are different price indexes because they cover different things and they take different angles. Arguably, the most common of the price indices is the consumer price index, which is just the average price of a basket of goods and services purchased by a typical U.S. urban consumer. They look at something like 80,000 goods and services. They go out and they go shopping and they say, okay, here is a 24-ounce jar of Hellmann's mayonnaise, or a 64-ounce or a 2-liter bottle of Diet Coke. What did it cost last month? What does it cost this month? And you measure that for something like 80,000 different goods and services. And what you do is you look at the movement in those prices. You have a weighted average so that hypothetically, a 2-liter bottle of Diet Coke has a certain percentage of the entire price index, and that's what you go with. Now, of course, when you're looking at consumers and only consumers, the weighting of different things in the price index is going to be different than when you're looking at the entire economy. I mean, think about it. If you look at the entire economy, housing is going to be a smaller proportion of what you spend your money on than it would be if you're just looking at consumers. For many of us, housing costs might be half of what we spend or more in an individual month. Our rent, our mortgage, interest payments on the mortgage, and all of that housing costs could be, but in the entire economy, housing is not going to be more than 50%. So the consumer price index has different weights. I won't get into how they measure housing. That's for another day and another time. But the point is that the consumer price index is most widely used. It's used to cover cost of living adjustments when you have, say, a unionized contract, or if you're getting a benefit from the government and they want to increase that benefit annually based on a price index, they're most likely to be using the CPI. But the GDP deflator is the biggest, most comprehensive of all of the price index. It's not measuring what an average urban US household might buy. It's saying, let's measure the prices of every single thing that is in the GDP. And that could vary from a box of breakfast cereal all the way to a Boeing 777 aircraft. It's everything. Everything that is legal, of course, because it has to be counted in the GDP. And what we're
Professor,
trying to do is yes?
I just want to ask, is there like a difference in the way index or deflator is measured?
Yeah, that's actually what it, uh, uh, yes. uh, yeah, there are differences. Now I understand your question. Thank you, Ahmed. Now, the consumer price index is measured literally by having reports of prices of different goods and services reported into the Bureau of Labor Statistics every month. So there are literally shoppers who go out and they have a little electronic device and they're looking at a 2-liter bottle of Coke or a cost of a cup of coffee at Starbucks or whatever it is, or an automobile or a ticket price for a flight from New York to Miami. They can be looking at that and they're plopping in the numbers. And then they also ask businesses to report these numbers into them. And that's to the Bureau of Labor Statistics every month. The GDP deflator, which, as I said, measures the prices of all things that are covered by the GDP, all output produced in a particular calendar quarter in the United States. That's calculated by the Department of Commerce Bureau of Economic Analysis, and it's a quarterly figure. Those data come in quarterly, and the reporting is not done by shoppers going out and shopping things. The reports are sent into the government. There are forms that are online. They fill out these forms. They send them into the government with their prices. So there are differences to how they are calculated. The reason why we use the word deflator is because of how the GDP price index is used. It's used to deflate nominal GDP to come up with real GDP. Again, remember, real GDP, the growth in it, plus growth in this deflator equals the growth in nominal GDP. C equals A plus B, so to speak. And so it is used to deflate nominal GDP. So what does that mean? It means you take nominal GDP, you divide it by the GDP deflator, which would be, I don't know, 1.6827, whatever that is, and you come up with real GDP. That's how it's used. So it's used to deflate, to take out the impact of rising prices from nominal GDP. Is that helpful? Ahmed, does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does.
Okay, thank you for your question. Now, the Federal Reserve, among others, and I would dare say most macroeconomists, would say that the price index that they choose to use that tends to correlate most closely with what they consider to be the true inflation rate is the third one here, called the Personal Consumption Expenditures Deflator, or PCE deflator, which says, okay, let's take the 2/3 of the GDP that is personal consumption expenditures. That was the question on your exam. Let's just take those things that are the 2/3 of the GDP that are in PCE. Look at how the prices changed of all of those things that are just counted by the portion of the GDP that consists of what consumers are taking off the market. And let's look at how prices have changed there. The PCE deflator is the one that the Fed uses. Fed looks at all of them, but the one that the Fed effectively says, okay, our target is 2% inflation. Well, it's 2% inflation in this, with one proviso. What they take out of this is the cost of food and the cost of energy, because they're so variable, and that variation has to do with exogenous forces. So let's say there's a huge drought and all of the wheat crop is destroyed because there's no rain in the Midwest. That's an exogenous force. They take it out. So you're looking at PCE, all the things that you and I buy, all of them, not a market basket, all of them that are counted into GDP. We look at how the prices of those things have changed, and we create a price index from that. And then we go to something called the core PCE by taking that and saying, okay, let's exclude the prices of food and of energy. Like, look at what's happening now, for example, to the price of crude oil. It's rising rapidly and headed toward, we're in the mid 60s per barrel, headed toward 80. Some major forecasters are saying we could get to 100. I'm not one of them, but some are saying we can get to $100 a barrel. But it's risen, and because of that, you go to a gas station, and in the course of the last month, the price of a gallon of gasoline in New York is up about 35 cents just in the month. That's highly variable. We take it out. So, bottom line, PCE deflator is the chosen one by the Fed and most macroeconomists. It looks at the prices of all the final goods and services that are produced and taken off the market by the household sector. And then they focus in on the core, which takes out the price of food and energy. Okay? So there are various price indexes. There's a producer price index. There's all kinds of price indexes we won't get into because they're less widely used and, frankly, less widely respected. This is just simple math. It goes back to where we were literally at the beginning of the semester. How do you calculate a percentage change? Recognizing that the CPI is a monthly number. Of course, you take the more recent number, you divide it by the less recent number, you raise it to the 12th power, you subtract 1 and multiply by 100. So that's really it. Percentage change, this is equivalent to the question on your exam. If something went from 200 to 210, that's a 5% increase. Because if it had gone from 100 to 110 to 105, I'm sorry, that would be 5%. So if it went from 200 to 210, that's 5%.
Can I ask a question?
Of course.
In reference to the inflation of the, like when you said increasing the money supply isn't the only reason, but it's one of the reasons. With the World Bank giving out loans to lower income countries, would that be considered increasing the money supply without really anything else causing inflation to rise?
Yeah, because the money that the World Bank is lending to these countries is newly created. It had never been sort of in the global economy circulating before. So of course it would tend to be, I'm hedging again, tend to be inflationary. All other things remaining the same, it would be inflationary. Now, the reason they're lending that money to less developed nations is because their economies are struggling. And when you have struggling economies, it means aggregate demand is weak. that's not going to be a situation where putting money out there is going to generate much inflation. But to come back to the heart of your question, whenever you are simply throwing liquidity into the marketplace without there being a commensurate increase in supply, what you're saying is I'm creating potential aggregate demand. That's why I'm putting money out there so people could spend it. I'm creating aggregate demand, but if there's no increase in aggregate supply, that would be inflationary. But inflationary doesn't mean necessarily that you're going to cause the inflation rate to go to the roof. What it means is you're putting upward pressure on prices. But if the economy remains terribly weak and people are not spending that money, if that means that that you're putting the money there, but it's really being spent because the economy is weak, you may be putting upward pressure on inflation, but that pressure is very, very minimal because aggregate demand is weak. So you guys are having trouble hearing me, huh? Okay, I got the message. I don't need any more messages. I'm not sure what to do about that.
Your words are breaking up, Professor.
No, I know. I've gotten a lot of messages that way. Are you hearing any better now? I haven't changed anything. Nothing's different than it was 10 minutes ago.
It's
I don't
just
really
kind of
know.
laggy.
Okay. Well, I'm not sure what to do about that, ladies and gentlemen. I haven't changed any settings. Nothing's different.
Professor, would it be
Yes.
possible to quickly leave and join the session back, or would it just end the session?
Okay, well, why don't we do that? Let me try something, okay? Just hang in there. Don't you do anything, okay?
It sounds a little better right now. Oh, nah, he left.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're fine, sir.
Well, thank you. Thank you for letting me know. Honestly, I didn't change any settings, so I'm not sure why that happened. Okay. I guess I'm thrown a little bit off kilter by the first 15 minutes of our time together today, so you have to excuse me. I've been teaching for 40 years. I've never been insulted by students before, so. Okay. So one of the things we notice when you look at inflation has been its dramatic decline secularly, meaning over the course of decades. There's absolutely no doubt that starting roughly around 1979 or 80, inflation came under control. The inflation rate began to drop precipitously, and it dropped and dropped and dropped until it is where it is now. And you can see it's pretty steady at a level below 2%, or even, well, certainly below 3%. One of the things that happened was effectively the Federal Reserve learned how to control it. It learned more about the relationship between money and inflation, despite all of the uncertainty in that relationship. And government learned a little bit more about the relationship between inflation and real economic growth, and inflation and fiscal policy. And all in all, better policies, a stronger dollar, which makes imports cheaper into the US. And the fact that the economy changed so much, that you had more global competition. And think about it, it's hard for you as a business to raise your price when you know that your customers could get the same thing cheaper, maybe if they went and bought something from another country. So if you're, let's say, General Motors, you have to keep your prices of your cars under control because you know that people will go to Toyota or they'll go to Nissan or Kia or wherever to get a similar product, and they'll say, I'm just dissatisfied, but I bought the foreign product. So global competition mattered. Also, technology has changed so much, and we know that it's a whole lot cheaper to do so many things now than it was in the past. Simply because the technology's changed. A technology like digitalization makes everything so much cheaper. Think how much cheaper it is now to make a telephone call than when your parents or grandparents had to make one. You know, telephone calls to you are basically priceless. You don't get charged for long distance. You can call foreign countries and not even get charged with some systems. And some of you using your phone will use, WhatsApp or something like that and communicate with people in another country at no cost. So all of these things have dampened down the permanent inflation rate. And it explains a little bit why it's so much harder now than ever before for central banks to try to maneuver that inflation rate, particularly to try to make it go higher. I'm going to move ahead. Okay, so here we come to some critical questions. If money is not the sole cause for inflation, what does cause the inflation rate to accelerate? What we do know is that all inflation, all of it, is that it's a form of sustained growth in demand relative to supply. So what does that mean? It means, in simple terms, that inflation is created whenever the growth in aggregate demand persists at a rate faster than the growth in aggregate supply. Let me repeat that. I don't know how many of you take notes. I hope all of you do. But let me repeat that. Whenever you have sustained, persistent growth in aggregate demand faster than sustained, persistent growth in aggregate supply, upward pressure is put on prices. You tend to get inflation. This is just about the only simple truism that we know about inflation. That being the case, all inflation is a kind of demand pull inflation. It's a kind of inflation that's caused, as I said now for the third time, by demand growing at a rate that is sustained faster than the rate of growth of output on a sustained basis. You get more and more spending power, and the spending power is growing faster than the availability of goods and services. Yeah, those goods and services are going to become more expensive. So as you look out, let's say over the over the spring and summer months, we're already seeing that airfares are ratcheting upward higher and higher. Why? Because Delta Airlines, United Airlines, American Airlines, JetBlue, whatever they are, they only have a certain number of seats. That's supply. But right now, people are saying, okay, I've gotten the vaccine, I'm vaccinated, I'm comfortable that the people sitting next to me likely by the summertime will be vaccinated. People are buying tickets left and right. The demand is growing faster than the available supply. That supply is fixed. And so the seats are filling up. So what are the airlines doing? They're jacking up the ticket prices. Exactly what you would think they would do. So that's the one truism. All inflation is a kind of demand pull. But what it also does is it knocks out this notion that inflation really, on a sustained basis, is a cost push. So you will get people who will say, well, this is 2021, and what we're seeing is that lumber prices, the prices of lumber, building construction material, is at an all-time high because we're building houses at a rate which is incredible. Why is that? because young people in particular are leaving the cities and they want to go to suburbs and exurbs far away from the city, and they want to buy houses. And those houses are going up and going up and going up. And when they go up, you need lumber to do that. And so lumber prices have hit, no pun intended, they've hit the roof. They've gone up sky high. We've never seen lumber prices this high. And yes, that has added to the cost of a new home. The estimate is that that has already added roughly $4,000 to $5,000 to construction costs for a new house. That's a form of cost push inflation, but it's not going to last. Notice I keep using the word sustained or persistent. It's going to go away because eventually some of that demand is going to die off. We're not going to have relatively young people in particular forever saying, I'm getting out of the cities and I'm going to the suburbs. So it's not sustained. And so we really can get bursts where the inflation rate goes higher because of materials costs, so the cost of energy. But it doesn't account for the fact that the inflation rate goes up and up and up and up and up and up on a sustained basis. That's not it. What does cause the inflation rate to go up, 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 or down, 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 is the relationship between the growth in aggregate demand and the growth in aggregate supply. Okay? This is an important slide. It effectively gets at that particular point. Well, the quantity equation, or the equation of exchange, is one that we work a lot with. It's a difficult concept for many people, even though it has four simple variables: money supply, velocity, the price level, and real GDP shown as a Y. And what it effectively says on the left side, MV, you take the money, you turn you get a sense of how frequently or effectively that money is turning over. That's velocity. That's spending. So think of the MV side as being the spending side. Speak of the PY side as being the earning side. Well, of course they have to be equal. If I spend $1, someone is earning $1. So the left side, MV, being sort of a spending concept, the PY side being an earning concept, and of course, because the price level times real GDP is nominal GDP. And nominal GDP is the measure of the total dollar value of all final goods and services produced and transacted in the marketplace. So of course, that's the earning side. We said national income and product account. So yes, that is an income concept. Excuse me, let me just go backward. Okay. The word velocity. Here's another case like Say's law, where oftentimes the attempt to simplify it violates what it really is. Some people will look at velocity and they will say, how many times does an individual dollar turn over? No, that's not what it is. And indeed, when you look at the term velocity is sort of like speed. And so, in the current environment where business is so crummy, if you went into a restaurant and you ask the restaurateur, so how's business? The restaurateur might say, things are still very slow. Notice how we look at slow. So what does that mean? It means doesn't have many customers. The food in his kitchen is not turning over terribly fast. We think of it as slow that way. But velocity, in a more technical sense, for a macroeconomist, means you can't use the colloquialism. You have to think of it as what it is. And velocity is not something we could measure directly. It is just a statistical abstract. So look at M times V equals P times Y. The definition of velocity is simply P times Y divided by M. Let me repeat that. Velocity is not the number of times an individual dollar turns over. Maybe you got that in Economics 101, but that's not what it is. Velocity is just a statistical abstract. It just says if MV equals PY, which by the way equals GDP, nominal GDP, So we could say here MV equals PY equals nominal GDP. Then velocity is a statistical abstract that just says velocity equals PY over M, or GDP, nominal GDP over M. Well, think about that. Nominal GDP over M. What that's really saying is the number of dollars of nominal GDP per dollar of money supply. Number of dollars of GDP divided by money supply means it's the number of dollars of GDP per dollar of money supply. Now that gives you some meaning, because if the number of dollars of GDP per dollar of money supply is rising, then it means economic activity is probably growing. That's probably good. You're getting more bang for the buck, literally. Think of the dollar as the buck. You're literally getting more bang, GDP, more output, more national income per dollar of money supply. If that number is falling, if you're increasing the money supply faster than you're increasing GDP, it means you're putting all that money out there and it's not doing very much to stimulate your economy. Velocity would fall because the denominator, M, would be rising faster than the numerator, PY, which is GDP. So velocity is simply the number of dollars of nominal GDP per dollar of money supply. That's a meaningful concept because we look at that and we want to know if the Fed induces slower or faster GDP growth, what is that going to mean to money supply growth? What is that going to mean to GDP? What you want is more bang. You want more GDP per dollar of money supply. But if that's not the case, if you're just putting money out there and the GDP is not growing as a result of it, your velocity will be falling. And if the velocity is falling, then you know that increasing the money supply is not helping your economy. These are the kinds of things we have to look at as central bankers. Okay? Any questions about this?
No.
Thank you. So I'm not going to emphasize, and I won't test you on the next. So remember, I'm telling you, I will not test you on what's happening in the next 3 or 4 slides because it's based on classical theory. But I'm obligated to at least present it to you very, very quickly. You know, there are those who look at something called the quantity theory of money, who believe that real GDP is exogenously given. You know what that means? Is that real GDP comes about from things that are outside the forces of the interactions within the circular flow diagram, which we now know are not true. It says that GDP is determined by real forces and that these are long-term. Well, it effectively says that in the very short run, there really isn't anything that monetary or fiscal policy could do that would change the underlying real growth rate of the economy. That actually makes some sense. But it's an assumption that you have to deal with, like many assumptions, because it could be wrong. I mean, in the short run, you might be able to affect real GDP. Think about it for a moment. Congress is about to pass, the House is likely to pass this week, the $1.9 trillion, whatever you call it, rescue package, stimulus package, call it what you want. And it's going to affect real GDP in the second half of this year. People are going to be getting those $1,400 checks. They're going to be getting the enhanced unemployment insurance. They're going to be getting the tax write-offs for their dependents, especially their children. That's going to put more money in people's hands. They're going to go out and they're going to spend. And when they spend, that's going to affect real GDP. So these are the assumptions of the classical model that so many of us, talk about. I'm going to skip it. It's here for you if you want to study it. It's in your textbook, of course, because all of these PowerPoint presentations are based on your textbook. And why don't we just go past it? The neutrality of money. There is a real debate as to whether or not money is neutral. whether or not money supply in and of itself has any effects on the real economy other than to affect prices. So let's explore that for a moment. The argument that I have made now for decades in my classes is to say, okay, suppose all of a sudden in every city in the United States, all of the aircraft that were in the airport took off all at once. They opened up a hatch and they just dropped money out of the airplane, and people could pick up that money. Call it aircraft money, call it helicopter money. It just came tumbling down. People picked it up. They were happy. I just picked up hundreds and 20s and 50s. They're really happy. Does that necessarily translate into any real effects on the economy? And the answer probably is no, it doesn't yet, because nothing happens when you increase the money supply until something else occurs. And that something else is that people have to spend it. Until and unless that money is spent, it has no effect on the economy. One of the arguments that the Republicans are making about the $1.9 trillion package, effectively why 49 of the 50 Republicans, one Republican didn't vote, as a group said, nope, we don't want this, is in part because the package had things that had nothing to do with COVID-19. But they looked at it and they said, what are you doing? You're putting money in the hands of people. We just had 365,000 jobs created last month. People are going back to work. Real GDP is picking up. People are now in states where they don't even have any kind of COVID-related restrictions, don't have to wear masks. Businesses are coming back. People's balance sheets on average, have gotten a lot better. That's not everybody, meaning people have paid down their debts. They've gotten all this money. They've paid off credit cards. They paid down some of their mortgages. They paid off some of their student loans, etc. People's balance sheets are really strong. You know, the things they owe are their liabilities. Their assets have gone up in general so far this year until this past couple of weeks when we had the rotation in the stock market and the bond market got crunched. But people's portfolios have done a lot better. Why are we putting money in their hands? They're not going to spend it. They're going to put the money into financial assets, or they're going to continue to pay down debt. Now, that's not everybody, but they're looking at the median person saying half the people at least are going to do what I just described. And that's a lot of millions of people. So why are we giving money to people? Money will prove to be neutral in that environment for at least half of the population, where they take the money and it doesn't affect the real economy in any way, except for the fact that they now have more spending power. And if they have more spending power, they're going to be more tolerant of higher prices. They're going to go to the supermarket and they're going to buy something and it's going to be more expensive than last week. They're going to go to their barber shop, and the barber used to charge, X number of dollars for a haircut, and now the barber is charging, X plus 5. And you're saying, whoa, what happened? I used to come here and only spend X dollars. Now I'm spending X plus 5. Yeah, because that's how it's going to work. So we're going to see it in inflation, but in terms of the real economy, hey, the real economy is going to be based on productivity growth and growth in the labor force, growth in hours worked. That's what gives you your sustainable growth rate, which was another question on the exam. That's what gives you your sustainable growth rate. In the end, it's not going to be how much money dropped out of airplanes. So we want to be careful about that. And then going forward, we ask another question, and that is, do people have a money illusion? Does the mere fact that people have more money in their pocket, does it literally make them more willing to spend more than they would have yesterday? Do they feel richer just because they have more dollars? Are they looking at whether prices went up? So sure, you got 2% more money, but the inflation rate was 3%. You're actually poorer. Yeah, you got 2% more, but what you're buying is 3% more expensive. You've gone backward. So these are the kinds of things we look at. Money illusion is exactly that people are more willing to accept higher prices when they have more money to spend because they think that they're doing better off, that they're better off. But in fact, they may not be. They may be worse off. They got a raise of 2%, but the PCE deflator, core PCE deflator, let's use the term, may have gone up by 3 or 4 or 5%. So yeah, you got 2% more money, but your prices are up by 5%. You're actually 3% worse off than you were before. That's a money illusion. Okay. So we're going to finish by looking at what, again, I tell you this explicitly. This is one of the 5 or 6 most important concepts we will discuss the entire semester. And it could not be more relevant as we discuss economics on March 8th. And it's something called the Fisher equation, named after economist Irving Fisher. The Fisher equation. Nominal interest rate consists of 2 parts, a real interest rate and an inflation expectation. 2 parts. People ask all the time, what do you mean by a real interest rate? And the easiest way to think of a real interest rate is the interest rate that would exist in a world where the inflation expectation is 0. Because if the inflation expectation was 0, it would be I equals R plus 0. So I and R would be the same thing. What is the nominal interest rate? Well, that's the interest rate that you see. So if you take out a loan and I say to you, okay, you borrowed money, how much are you paying in interest? And you say 6%, that's the nominal interest rate. That's what you're paying. Or if I say to you, you got a CD at the bank, a 10-year CD, and it paid, I don't know, 100 basis points, 1%. That would be the nominal interest rate. So look at the interest rate, I, the nominal interest rate, and you know that embedded in that interest rate are 2 different things, one of which is an inflation expectation. Now, one of the things that's happening now in financial markets is that interest rates have been rising, and they've been rising especially, beyond 2 years out, from 2 years to 30 years, interest rates have been rising. This morning when I looked, the 10-year Treasury note had an interest rate, and this was a couple of hours ago, of 1.64%, which is like 100 basis points higher than it was just a few months ago when it was in the 60s or 80s. Well, one of the things that's happening is that you have a combination of R and pi both going up, but really what's happening is the R. So let me get at that. In previous classes, I've talked with you about why currently there are those who believe that the inflation rate is not only picking up, but it will continue to go up, and that soon it will surpass the Fed's 2% inflation target. And I pointed out a number of different things to you. I pointed out that the money supply has been growing at in excess of 25 or 26% on a sustained basis. Wow, it's really fast money supply growth. That you have a huge stimulus package, which is creating aggregate demand. And if aggregate demand grows faster than aggregate supply, and remember, aggregate supply depends upon productivity plus growth in hours worked or the labor force, then that tends to put upward pressure on prices. I've already talked with you about the rising price of energy, the rising price of lumber and other commodities. Adding that all up, there are a number of folks out there who see the inflation rate accelerating and saying that it's going to go higher and higher and higher. So inflation expectations have moved up a bit. That's the pi. R, as you know, is the interest rate that would exist in a world where we had no inflation expectations. So it's telling you, okay, why are banks charging you the interest rate they're charging you for that particular loan, or paying you the interest rate they're paying you on your deposits or your CDs? And some of that is risk. There are all kinds of risk. You could have default risk, meaning someone is not going to pay the loan back, or they're going to pay it back late, or they're going to pay it back partially. That's default risk. But there's all kinds of other risks. There's operational risk, risk that You have an event like you had in Texas where the infrastructure goes down. You could have risk that's based upon policy that just says, well, what if unfortunate legislation of different types is passed, or you have political unrest here or in other countries? There's all kinds of risks that you could be looking at. That's got to be embedded in your real interest rate, because you got to look at that and you got to say, in the end, if I'm lending you money, I want some sort of assurance I'm going to get paid back. But one of the things that drives that capital R is the relative strength of the economy. Because if the economy is projected to expand faster, there's going to be more demand for credit relative to the supply of credit. And whenever you get more demand for something relative to supply, you're going to see price goes up, and the price of liquidity is capital R, is the real interest rate. Well, a lot of folks are projecting, myself included, that in the second half of this year, we're going to be seeing an expansion in the economy at rates we haven't seen in really half a generation or more. We might see real economic growth in the second half of the year. Who knows, at a 7% annual rate, something in that area. There's a big brokerage house who has it over 10%. That's not the consensus, but that's one view. But if you're going to get that kind of growth, then you're going to get growth in demand for credit. People are going to be buying cars and houses and businesses and capital equipment and the like, in which case you would expect that the price of that will go up, R will rise. So the Fisher equation has these two pieces. It's got all these dynamics that are affecting capital R, or the real rate of interest, which can be affected by risks. It could be affected by the outlook for the economy and other factors, including profit. And then you got pi, which is the inflation expectation. What we will be doing starting on Wednesday is going really deeply into that inflation expectation. And how do you get an expected rate of inflation? How do you sit there, other than the fact that you know that there's some relationship between money and inflation, but how do you come up with a number? That's what we will be doing on Wednesday. So to wrap this up, Wednesday we'll go over the homework. I guess I said we'd do it today, but we'll do it Wednesday. Wednesday we'll go over the homework. Wednesday, if you have any individual questions about things that were on the exam, let's start with that at 11:15. We'll do that for a while, and we'll finish this topic of inflation. I guess that's it. Any questions at this point? Again, I would just tell you that this is a first exam. Believe me when I tell you, in 40 years of teaching this course, your grades are not that unusual. It's okay. It's hard to get your arms around this immediately, but I accept the fact, I don't, because I've given this exam before. I don't accept that this exam was too hard or that you didn't have enough time. I'm sorry, we'll just agree to disagree on that particular point, but I will tell you, I will promise you that you will do better on the second exam. And it's not because I will make the exam easier or shorter. It's just that you will become more and more familiar with terminology. You'll become more and more familiar with the types of questions you get. And hopefully you got a little bit of a kick in the rear end that said, hey, I need to work differently or more, or maybe both, more and differently. And you're going to do better. And there will be people getting A's in this class, and there will be people getting B's in this class, etc. So relax, do your work, work harder. But I don't accept that this exam was too hard. We're going to agree to disagree, I guess, among many of you. So that's it. I respect your point of view. I hear it. There's nothing much I can say. You've taken the exam already. So you'll do better the next time, I can promise you. And you'll feel better about yourself, and you'll feel better about what you're learning, because grades are not given until May. This is only March. You have a long way to go to earn your grade, to earn your knowledge. And ultimately, what matters is what do you walk out of this class with that can help you in your life? That's what I'm shooting for. I'm not shooting for you to win in the second inning of the game. I'm shooting to win as a sports coach after the ninth inning of the game or after the fourth quarter of a basketball game. No one cares what the score is after one quarter of the game. You care about what the score is at the end of the game. So relax. I've seen this before many, many, many times. I know what happens. So we'll talk about this some more if you have any more questions on Wednesday. Okay. Thank you for those of you who made constructive comments. I appreciate that. I appreciate your point of view. And I'll see you on Wednesday.